Well, hello there, everybody. I'm Russ Reed, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Center for the Biotechnology Workforce, located in Winston-Salem in the Innovation Quarter, part of Foresight Technical Community College. And I'm delighted today because we have a special guest, Dr. Nathan Algrim from the Good Food Institute. And of course, we have Trevor Tufano, who's our loyal technician for doing these side techs. Gentlemen, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited to join you again. We may get into this in the future, but since you and I were able to meet face to face about a month ago, I've been itching to do this ever since.
Trevor?
I'm doing well myself, Russ. Thank you for asking.
Great. Well, Nathan, thanks for joining us today. Your role at Good Foods is academic community manager at the Good Food Institute. But before we get into that, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes, well, having my current role as academic community manager as the end point, I took a very winding career path to get with the Good Food Institute. Originally, I was trained in very basic neuroscience, so no clinical application whatsoever, just tinkering around in the brain trying to figure out how that worked. So that's kind of the foundation. I always think in terms of the scientist's perspective. But I spent a while in education, both teaching formally and informally, everyone from fourth graders to community college students. And then I really wanted to start devoting my career to a much more environmental ethic. I spent a year teaching and running an environmental summer camp in the mountains of North Carolina before finally finding my home at the Good Food Institute. So now, which is why I was able to join you in person a while ago. I am based out of Hickory, North Carolina, and have been with the Good Food Institute for just under a year now.
Well, congratulations, Nathan. That's great. And we're really pleased that you're here in North Carolina. That's fantastic. We're all about North Carolina. What is the Good Food Institute?
Very broadly, the Good Food Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit think tank. And our entire driving mission, our purpose is to develop a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. And what that means, based on the science that we have seen come out of every sector, is that our protein supply needs to transition to alternative proteins. And by that, I'm talking about foods that replicate animal products, because we know people love animal products, frankly, myself among them. But though having that industrialized animal agriculture is incredibly harmful for the environment, for human health, and many other cause areas. So we act in the science and technology sector, promoting the research to make sure that those products are not only good, but available and able to be scaled. We work in policy, making sure the regulations facilitate the growth of that sector. And we work with corporate engagement to ensure that we are supporting the companies creating these products and that those products can get to consumers, whether that be in restaurants or also at the grocery store. And what I find so incredibly powerful about GFI, again, since I'm relatively new, is that we are 100% funded by donors, by philanthropy. And that really surprised me starting out. But what that means is we can stay 100% mission focused, and we don't need to align our work to any sort of outside groups. It is purely because other people, whether they be individuals or other foundations, see that this is the way forward as well and want to help us get there.
Nathan, thanks. I'm going to pass it over to Trevor. He's got a couple questions for you too.
Sure. So, kind of going into more detail about some of these alternative proteins, could you maybe give us a little bit more detail about what exactly an alternative protein is, and also maybe provide some examples of them?
Of course. So when we talk about alternative proteins, they are the things that in a perfect world, you don't recognize that you are eating a plant-based product as opposed to a burger. So the way that I like talking about it is products that people may be familiar with, like a Beyond Burger, an Impossible Burger. The goal of that is to taste like a hamburger. So what we work with is not something like a black bean burger or whole foods like tofu. those absolutely have their place. That's just not really what we are doing, because we know that people really, it's so hard to have people give up the foods that they love, whether it just be because of personal preference or a cultural connection to a food. We've got Thanksgiving coming up, and I know the prospect of telling my family, like, hey, what if we don't have a turkey as the centerpiece? And that kind of cuts to the culture of our family connecting every year. And that's why we want to be replicating these products to be as delicious, if not more so, as affordable, if not more so, and of course, accessible. Now, when it comes to how these are created, we divide the alternative protein sector into three big pillars of technology. The first being plant-based, and that is probably what most people would be familiar with. The Beyond Burger being an excellent example. They take plant ingredients because they're made with the same things, the fats, the proteins, the carbohydrates, the minerals, vitamins, and they are processed and rearranged in such a way to replicate that meat experience. We've got the other pillar of fermentation products, and that's using microorganisms and other usually single or multicellular fungi or bacteria to make products, again, that are replicating that meat experience. Now, these are some of the earliest players in the alternative protein field. Some of the listeners may be familiar with Quorn, spelled Quorn, and that's been around since the 80s. They use basically the root structure of what we see as mushrooms, the mycelium, and that gives wonderful fibrous texture as well as a high protein content. And we also, under that pillar, have precision fermentation, where you can basically use little cellular factories, whether they be friendly E. coli or other yeasts, and they basically just crank out an ingredient that we're looking for. It can be a flavoring agent, it can be a protein, whatever we're looking for. And then the third pillar is the one that probably has gotten the most buzz and media recently, is cultivated meat. And that has the distinction of not being a meat analog. Cultivated meat is meat. We're growing animal cells, protein, fats, connective tissue in bioreactors. For anybody who has done cell culture in a lab or in their work, it's that technology. And so you're essentially growing chicken breast without the chicken. And even though that still kind of sounds science fiction, as of June, there are 2 companies approved to be selling to American consumers, currently only available in 2 restaurants. But that's part of what we're doing, is helping everyone figure out how to scale this industry all across the board.
That's great. So kind of looking at some of the different pillars that you explained and some of the examples of these alternative proteins that you discussed, are any of these alternative proteins that you mentioned like available to consumers now? I know you mentioned that there's 2 companies that were approved to have for that particular third pillar, but are there any other alternative proteins that are currently available?
Absolutely. And frankly, the market is exploding over the past about 5 years to 10 years. Before I go into any more specific products, I do want to clarify that the Good Food Institute promotes the sector. We do not specifically endorse one product over the other. Any examples I'm giving are because they might have a little more name recognition. So like the Beyond and Impossible Burger are the ones that probably are available to most people, especially at restaurants. You got the Impossible Whopper, that sort of thing. And we're seeing just the incredible diversification of products. Now, if you go into a grocery store, this is when it can get tricky, because even the same grocery chain, depending on where they are, sometimes the plant-based sausages are right next to the meat sausages. And sometimes they are off in their own section of being plant-based. The grocery store that I go to does both. They have the Beyond Burger next to the beef burgers, but then the plant-based chicken products are off in their own section as opposed to the traditional chicken products. So if you're looking for them, you might have to spend some time in the grocery store. But what I'm really excited about is how many companies are getting involved. So you have the companies that are kind of only doing alternative proteins, And that kind of makes sense for a lot of models, the Beyonds, the Impossibles. Now Morningstar, which used to really lean into the black bean burger territory, they're expanding to alternative proteins, those products that are trying to replicate meat. But you're also getting players like Tyson and Purdue, some of the largest meat producers, not just in the country, but in the world. At first, they, as one example, would produce these products under basically a subsidiary, a different line. Raised and Rooted was an original plant-based chicken product. And now we have both Tyson and Purdue under their own brand name, having either fully plant-based or blended products in which you're essentially supplementing the chicken protein with plant protein. And what I see that is, and we'll probably get into this more later, we are seeing a parallel progression as we did with the energy industry, where fossil fuel industries are diversifying their portfolio to renewables, basically because they see that's where the future heads, and they would miss out if they didn't join up. And then I do also want to give a special shout out to some of the products that people can see in the fermentation space, because talking about that precision fermentation, that allows for, especially when we're talking about the world of dairy, a lot more effective products there. If any of the listeners or either of you two, maybe 5 years ago, tried a plant-based cheese or plant-based ice cream, you might know that it left the experience lacking a little bit. And now there are a lot of companies exploring precision fermentation animal proteins, which means you can essentially have animal-free milk, animal-free ice cream with the same proteins, the whey proteins, the casein proteins, that never involved a cow, because we're able to produce those animal proteins with our little cellular factories. So if you tried plant-based dairy a while ago and it didn't impress you, products like Brave Robot ice cream, and this isn't the same technology, but Nature's Find cream cheese as two examples that are getting more available. I'd really encourage everybody to try them out again.
Great. Trevor, thanks. Nathan, thanks. Nathan, can we get into a little bit more detail about maybe if you just select an alternative protein and how it's made? I'm thinking more along the lines of how it will reflect on people that are training underneath biotechnology right now.
Absolutely. And I think we have all different ways of segmenting the sector. So the bigger umbrella of cellular agriculture is really relevant to this sector of the workforce. So cellular agriculture is kind of exactly what it sounds like, even though it doesn't actually make that much sense. It's using single-celled organisms to create whatever we are looking for. Instead of growing plants, we're growing cells. And so this covers both the fermentation side, if we're using them as cellular factories to produce a protein, as an example, or cultivated meat, where we are growing those cells to be the animal muscle, the animal fat. And so what that means is that we are really just using the tissue culture, the cell culture technology that has been so widely used in the pharmaceutical and health industries to now join into the food industry. So taking cultivated meat as one example, from start to finish, you start off with a very small biopsy of an animal. And depending on the process, depending on the needs of that consumer base, the animal doesn't even need to be slaughtered. It would be very similar, like you have, in terms of scale, you have something on your arm that a dermatologist needs to check out, they take a biopsy, like it's that much. And from there, for those of you who are familiar with the necessities of cell culture, the cells get immortalized. So we're basically inducing them to be stem cells, and that can happen either spontaneously or through some sort of engineering, whether that be genetic or environmental, for where the cells are living. Once those cells are back in that stem cell state, well, now this is where the biotech really comes into play, because we need to figure out a way to have them grow at scale which often means in suspension, which mammalian cells really don't like doing, and keep them healthy. And we're talking like tens of thousands of liters of bioreactors as the goal. Really scales that we see in fermentation for beer production or other sorts of alcoholic beverages, but not so far in food. That's where a lot of the research and development is happening. But once we have all of those cells grown, we need to differentiate them from those stem cells into whatever we want, the muscle, the fat, and then figure out a way to turn that into something. Now, the products that I have talked about so far really have stayed in the realm of, blended products. So like hamburger meat, ground meat, as opposed to a steak, a chicken fillet. Because that's just a lot harder to do when you start off with what is basically just a mass of cells. So the next step of that is having the technicians, the scientists, figure out how are we going to get these cells to behave in a way to replicate a whole cut of meat. So that's where the scaffolding comes in. And the scaffolding is taking a lot of different strategies as well from different companies. Sometimes that's essentially like a plant-based scaffold. You can even get a little extra and different nutrition, some fiber in there with a cultivated meat product. Others are working to have the cells grow their own extracellular matrix. So it really is like only the animal product. So there are a lot of different ways that this is working to be achieved. But when we think about how this would actually work at scale, that means you would need technicians in very similar regards to other food processing facilities, but also biotechnology facilities as well. So running and maintaining those bioreactors, most of which will be largely computerized. So we will need people fluent both in the engineering and the software and coding side. And then also, of course, the food safety, because doing this in bioreactors means you don't have the same sorts of contamination concerns of industrial animal agriculture, of disease outbreaks, of waste contamination. But you do need to make sure that you are maintaining that aseptic environment. It's a lot easier to notice if you aren't. For anyone who has done cell culture, as I have, and you walk in one morning and your entire experiment's ruined because you see stuff growing in it. You know when it's not going well, it's very easy to see, but you want to prevent that because that gets very expensive. And then finally, I'll wrap this up. I know I'm going on long, but I get excited. Thank you for indulging me. Is all of the inputs that go into it. So not just designing and fabricating those bioreactors, the growth environments, but basically the food for all of the cells, the cell media, the proteins, the growth factors, the salts that will be needed for those cells to grow and thrive. Because right now, the sector is set up for the pharmaceutical industry. And in the same way that a lot of what we eat is not nearly the same, like held to the same standard as what we would inject directly into our veins for medicine, there is pharmaceutical grade, which is incredibly expensive because of the purity requirements and the scales that it's produced at. And we will need to be growing that into a production line that creates food grade media, food grade inputs as well, which will also require a huge increase in that area of the workforce.
My gosh, Nathan, you paint an incredible picture of the future, and I'm thinking that this is very exciting from the point of view of when you mentioned Purdue and the others, because a lot of rural communities do that. That's what they have, right? They have food processing plants and so forth. And so this is very exciting to me. And thank you for bringing this information to us. I have a couple more questions, if you don't mind. So I think you've given us an idea of, that there are just going to be all sorts of jobs, and that's good. My interpretation of what you said is there'll be people who will be sort of doing cell cultures and so forth, and then there'll be people who will be on the production phase of it, and then there'll be people who will be in the commercialization of it. So there's just a lot. And of course, you mentioned too, informatics and programming and so forth. So this just really covers the whole scope of what we do here at our college. That's exactly what we do. And so we're very excited about that. How do you envision, though, that the necessary workforce be trained? Do you have any thoughts on that as a former teacher too? Yeah, I'd be interested to.
Well, that's your job. No, but as we're scoping this out, I think the survey that my colleagues at GFI conducted with many of our alternative protein startups is incredibly informative, because we are at this inflection point where the entire industry is transitioning from almost all startups, very small scale, to this is just another part of our food system. And so when we did this survey, we asked them basically, what are your biggest talent needs now? And what do you envision they will be in 5 years? And the area of need that saw the biggest growth as they projected into the future was manufacturing. And so these very fundamental, and when I say fundamental, I mean just like keeping the country going, jobs that programs like yours help facilitate of the biotechnology manufacturing side will be the most important. And this gets to something that I have learned more and more from conversations with people like you, that in many ways, dedicated alternative protein training programs very well might not be needed, because the application is just, hey, you're going to be working in the food sector as opposed to maybe the pharmaceutical industry or the medical industry more broadly. But the techniques, the quality assurance, the cell culture, of course, the manufacturing principles are all going to be the same. And so in many ways, just supporting the general bioeconomy, the growth of the bioeconomy, the biotechnology workforce, will also directly support the growth of the alternative protein workforce. But that is not, of course, to say that the alternative protein industry will just flourish on its own. Because in order to have the companies in a place where they can then hire all of those people, well, they need to be supported in the same way that our other food sector is. And that's why one of our biggest rallying cries at the Good Food Institute is government needs to fund this in the same way that government needs to fund not only other sectors of our food system, but the transition to a sustainable energy economy as well. And that through programs like Innovate Bio. Facilitating the creation of these training programs is really what we're going to need to make sure the industry can get there.
Well, thank you, Nathan and Trevor, for joining us today. Trevor, any comments?
I'd like to say just thank you for sharing kind of like more insight about the alternative protein industry and kind of how Good Food Institute fits into that. Me personally, I'm a big fan of oat milk in particular, and also Morningstar brand as well. I'm a fan of several of their products. So I'm definitely, interested in like alternative proteins and that kind of thing. So thank you for just kind of taking us into that world and telling us more about it.
Hey, Trevor, before we wrap up the session, and Nathan, now, I'm on the far side of life and you guys are on the beginning side of life, right? So how do people see this from, let's say, a less, let me reorientate this question. How do younger people envision this and see this? And I'd like to hear both your comments, because from my perspective, I'm a scientist, right? As trained as a scientist. So quite frankly, if we can do meat through lab processes and it's safe and effective, that's fine. I'm good with that. So, but how do you guys see it?
Trevor, you want to take that one first?
So just, I guess, in general, how I kind of see like the future of alternative proteins or that kind of thing. Is that what you're asking, Russ?
Yeah, from the point of view of like, consuming it and so forth, choosing it as an alternative. How do you see that?
So at least for me personally, I can definitely see, or I have seen quite a few people, at least in my sort of like age group be very interested in like alternative proteins? Like you see, even in like a lot of restaurants and whatnot, there's a lot of different alternative protein options being offered, and some of which I tried and am like interested in trying as well. So I can definitely see it being very popular and kind of growing more and more like popular as time goes on.
Pretty cool. Nathan?
Yeah, and I would say, I think I had mentioned this earlier, there's always ways to segment the population in the sector, of course. But in general, what we're seeing is that younger generations tend to just be earlier adopters of a lot of new technology, new opportunities. And so as a general demographic, people, I don't even know if I can say my age, but my age and younger tend to be the ones who are exploring these much more readily. And that's kind of what I would serve as a rallying cry for everybody, because our goal is not to remove choices, it's to add choices. And at this point, there's so much to explore. It's just fun. Even with me in my bias of wanting this platform to succeed, I've tried products where I'm not a fan and I will never buy again. That's fine. Now there are 9 others to choose from. And so I think a lot of it is just having that early adopter mindset of, I'm not sure if I'll like this, but I'll give it a shot. And that really can be a foot in the door for a lot of people.
That's great. Dr. Ahlgren, thanks for joining us on SciTech today. We look forward to a long partnership with Good Food Institute and yourself. And thanks for having come to the campus and met a lot of our people. We really appreciate that. And wish you all the best going forward. And Trevor, thanks for stepping up again today. Appreciate it. And that's it. People, that's SciTech for today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.